Hello, English 217, 417, Gothic American Literature. Our final video of quarantine semester, spring 2020. Wanted to finish up Child of God, and there's lots there. I read over, all your forum posts and just blown away by a lot of your insight and the sort of nuance that you're able to get out of the book. And so, yeah, great job. Quick note, and I'll put this in an email or Teams message. You can continue to write in the forums to kind of catch up if you missed some, and I'll be checking those by the end of the day, Tuesday of next week of finals week. So if you want to get credit for your forum participation, join in before next, or by the end of next Tuesday. Okay, let's get right into it. Many of you on some of these threads were really getting into the heart of the book, where the title, Child of God, is interrogating how far we're willing to let that concept go. If a child of God doesn't mean, just somebody that purports to follow some deity, but is in fact a title for humanity as such. If humanity is made in the imago Dei, the image of God, and there's something special about humans, unique, and connected to the potential of the divine and of some sort of transcendent goodness, then what do we do with characters like Lester Ballard? So let's just start, because I want to get to the end of the book. So I'm going to kind of do some quick readings of a few passages and then camp, right near the end of the book. But starting on page 156, this is a dynamic that a lot of you picked out from the very beginning of the book, which is great. And I commented a little bit on it in my first video. So page 156, that paragraph that's at the bottom, is during the flood. Ballard's running, and this flood inundates the whole county. He came up flailing and sputtering and began to thrash his way toward the line of willows that marked the submerged creek bank. He could not swim, but how would you drown him? His wrath seemed to buoy him up. Some halt in the way of things seemed to work here. See him. You could say that he's sustained by his fellow men, like you. Has peopled the shore with them, calling to him. A race that gives suck to the maim and the crazed, that wants their wrong blood in its history and will have it. And it goes on. But, the narrator, when McCarthy lets his narrator step in occasionally to kind of meta comment, it's often to sort of make us step back and have the mirror put on us. He's saying that society wants these outcasts in order to consider themselves to be immune from the sort of maladies that clearly torture Lester. And so, as many of you said, I think Jason Blevin said, he didn't have a fair shake or something, might be paraphrasing. And Ariana got at this in one of her posts to lead off. And exactly, didn't have parents. And as we saw at the beginning, the noose on which his father hanged himself still stands or still hangs in the barn that we see at the beginning. But this isn't in any way a sort of psychological, sentimental sob story, but simply, it's an examination of what society considers, well, this is normal, the normal spectrum of human desires, behaviors, and they remain within these parameters, and these other people scare us, so we'll just consider them to be misshapen and ill-formed and not really human, although we might not put it that way, right? And that's a lot of the thesis of the book here, that the majority of society that, of course, we all are horrified at Lester's behavior and that kind of thing. but the majority of society refuses to recognize the traits within themselves that, though not as fully developed as they become in Lester, and though they've never been pushed to the extremes like he has, and though you know, they've never committed such horrific crimes, similar potential for depravity exists in all of humanity. Okay, so society in some ways is the cause and the sustainer of someone like Lester. The book seems to be saying 156. 158, you know, we see his struggle with sanity in some ways, and he had not stopped cursing. Whatever voice spoke to him was no demon, but some old shed self that came yet from time to time in the name of sanity, a hand to gentle him back from the rim of his disastrous wrath. One of the things that makes the book so moving to me is the way that McCarthy manages to show clearly a depraved and, well, you know, evil man, but one whom, you know, one who recognizes himself occasionally and steps back. The next passage, I'm going to draw our attention to page 170. You know, he's escaped more or less. He's watching down from a mountain. He watched the mule drink, and then the man on the wagon seat lifted one arm, and they commenced again, now soundless, out of the creek and up the road, and then again came the far muted wooden rumbling. Now, he watched the diminutive progress, you know, it's like watching in miniature from the top of a mountain. He watched the diminutive progress of all things in the valley, the gray fields coming up black and corded under the plow, the slow green occlusion that the trees were spreading. Squatting there, he let his head drop between his knees, and he began to cry. You know, he's watching springtime and the renewal of life, and he knows that he's utterly cut off from human society now. That there is no chance for, obviously, a normal life, but for any communion with this fellow human. Okay, so then we really start getting towards the end. 182. This is when the men kidnap him from the hospital, where he wakes up after his arm's been blown off by John Greer. And they take him out, and they're clearly going to go lynch him in the old mill. Here we go. You got that cable, Fred? Sure do. A man stepped from the circle and came forward with a coiled and greasy braided steel cable. You're going to have to tie that one arm down. Anybody got a rope in their truck? I got one. Ask him about that, Ernest. Yeah, Ernest. The man turned to Ballard. What'd you want with them dead ladies? He said. Was you fucking them? Ballard's face gave a funny little jerk in the firelight, but he said nothing. He looked about at his tormentors. The man with the cable had uncoiled a part of it along the ground. There was a ring spliced into the end of it, and the cable was pulled through in a loop like an enormous rabbit snare. And goes on. You know, why do I bring our attention to that? There's something climactic about it, because the man, you know, labels it. And in some ways that seems to shock Ballard, because he's been living in a very unreal world. You know, the very first time he committed necrophilia, says something along the lines of, he whispered, you know, frantically or violently, he whispered into her ear all the things he had never been able to say to a woman. It's almost as if he doesn't think of it in the actual horrific and basic terms by which they're describing it. And then the other thing there is that it says he looked he looked about at his tormentors. We're given the perspective of Ballard here, and he's caught in a rabbit snare. And this is going to kind of transition us to some of our final points. Throughout, the delineation between human, animal, object, sentient being, all these kind of dichotomies is blurred, or is I guess, made a topic of argument. Is Ballard still a human, right? To what degree, and here we'll kind of transition, to what degree does he simply continue the commodification of women's bodies that, and this isn't like some sort of imposed politicalization on the text. It's written in 1973, and certainly McCarthy wouldn't have been doing that. But to what degree does he simply continue the commodification of women's bodies that has perhaps always existed, but was given new forms in the 60s and the 70s with the so-called sexual revolution, et cetera, where whether, people in America and around the world, but were, of course, not doing these sorts of things, were they not in other ways quantifying, selling, for advertising, really in the 20th century for the first time in such a overt way, selling for advertising, in all other ways, using and commodifying and putting price on women's bodies. So anyway, that kind of highlights it. And I don't know if you sense this too, as these men are taking him, there's this real sort of new and unique to the book intimacy between Ballard and the men. And what I mean is, you always sense, and this is clearly a direct symptom of his having lost his father and all that, you always sense that he has no comfort around other men. Somewhere towards the beginning of the book, towards the beginning, but somebody, to paraphrase, somebody else says, well, white women aren't worth the trouble, or something like that. And Ballard says something, and he says something else, and then the narrator says he had heard men say as much, or that was always something he had heard men say. He's pretending, he's putting on a show of trying to be a man, but he doesn't belong. And in some ways, in this passage, he's entered into the society of men for the first time. And I want to say as an equal. Of course they're going to kill him, or they're planning to kill him. I don't mean an equal like that, but he's not, there's nothing fake here. They know what he's done. They're going to kill him. They're I don't know exactly how to put it, but some of the things that point that out to me, they give him clothes, and they're these, soft overalls that smell like new laundry and that kind of thing. You think about it, it's likely that these are the first clothes he's been given since he was a child in his life. And it's the first time he's been given that much hospitality, And along those lines, again, these are sordid things to try to use for our thematic points. But one of the other reasons I think his face makes a funny little look, when the other guy puts so crassly, and why is he curious? Why are the other guys like, ask him about this, whatever? They're obviously have this sort of morbid fascination with it, But I think one of the other reasons is that he, as I said, he doesn't think of it just in those crass terms, actually. The tragic picture that we get, towards the beginning, he props up, one of the corpses of this young woman in the house and turns on the lights, has the fire going, and goes outside and looks in. And did you catch that? I mean, obviously it's all weird, but isn't that weird? I mean, what is he doing? It's heartbreaking. Okay, I'll say it. Of course, like, given a choice, you don't sympathize with the necrophiliac. Okay, But what's profound about literature is its ability to bend our perceptions, not to negate, sympathizing with the victims and even, these guys here who are going to hang on Ballard, but that we also can somehow see the tragedy of Ballard's life. He has the fire going. He sits up this corpse of this woman and goes outside and looks in through the windows as if he's, picturing the warmth of a home and family, his own that he doesn't have, as well as what he kind of fantasizes about. It doesn't make it, it's of course ghoulish and skewed and all sorts of things, but it's showing the deep longing for, I might have a kid coming out. Nope, something else. Sorry. The deep longing for home and for family. Okay. Sorry, on a video like this, we don't have the interaction. So if I lose my train of thought, there's no jokes that can be had. Okay, so the ending, there's lots going on. One of the first things to note, of course, there's this big flood. There's a Noah reference thrown out. You don't see any men with, old men with long beards out here, do you? The sheriff says to somebody else. And the flood in the Bible is a picture of baptism. Clearly, Ballard goes under the water and comes up. It's springtime. He weeps at his lost self. And then, even more dramatically, or on the nose, he's buried alive in a cave, right? I mean, he escapes from the men. And it says, the beginning of the chapter says, for 3 days, Ballard explored the cave he didn't enter. So, and he's in there longer than that, but there's some sort of McCarthy, who wouldn't, he doesn't have a lot of biography. He's kind of a recluse, but he's what people might call a lapsed Catholic. He comes from that background, so he's aware of the symbolism he's using. Ballard is buried in a tomb for 3 days, and then comes out into the sun. And when he does, this is page 190, 191. This is the end of the book. Pause. I'm going to tell you a quick story. Well, not even a story, just a little anecdote to go with this passage. Let's see. What year is it? 2020. So back in 2011, because our third son just turned 9 last week. Yeah. Or no, a couple weeks ago. Anyway, in 2011, we were pregnant with him. And that spring, I was working on my doctorate, and I was taking a Cormac McCarthy seminar. The whole class was on Cormac McCarthy. We read all 13 of his novels. And it was actually it was because of this book, and I love a lot of the other ones. They're not all like this. Read The Road if you haven't. Read All the Pretty Horses. Anyway, it was during this book, and it was on page 191 of this book that I sat back amazed, and I think I texted my wife or something, or maybe I just decided then told her at home, pregnant with our third son, we're going to name him Cormac. I mean, that was a potential name, and she was in agreement. I wasn't just, but you might ask, why on earth? Because of this book. Well, it's because of this passage, 190, 191. So now, here we go. So he comes out of the cave. He escapes, resurrected from the dead, you could say. And he waits till dark. He's seen sunlight coming down through this hole in the cave, but he waits till dark to come out. It was hours past dark and a black night when he finally emerged from the earth. Down at the house, there were lights. He cast about among the stars for some kind of guidance. Like you would look for the North Star or something. And okay. for some kind of guidance, but the heavens wore a different look that Ballard did not trust. It's almost as if something cosmic has changed since he went into the cave. He crossed through the woods and climbed a fence and crossed a field until he came to a road. And I'm not micro reading this, but McCarthy bears up under a micro reading. So the heavens bore a different look that Ballard didn't trust. He crossed through the woods, climbed a fence, as you saw in McCarthy or in Faulkner to some degree before quarantine happened, how fences and Benji hanging on a fence often is clearly a symbol for the cross, right? He crossed through the woods and climbed a fence and crossed a field until he came to a road. Anyway, it was no place he'd ever stood in before. Seeing that uphill, it led toward the mountains. That's always been the symbol of him, of running from people, of running from community and to a sort of isolated, what's the word I'm looking for? Myopicism. What's the word? Well, if you know it, you know what I'm trying to say. But, the mountains represent him running from community and into himself and what comes from that. But seeing that uphill it led toward the mountains, he took the other way and soon was hobbling along, weak but able, the night being as fine as you could wish, and a faint bloom of honeysuckle already on the air. At this time he had not eaten for 5 days. Honeysuckle, if you've ever lived in the South, is something that comes out in spring, very early summers. This is in Tennessee. And then here we go. He'd not gone far before a church bus hove into sight behind him. Ballard scuttled into the roadside weeds and crouched there watching. The bus clattered past. It was all lit up, and the faces within passed, each in their pane of glass, each in profile. At the last seat, in the rear, a small boy was looking out the window, his nose puttied against the glass. There was nothing out there to see, but he was looking anyway. As he went by, he looked at Ballard, and Ballard looked back. Then the bus rounded the curve and clattered from sight. Ballard climbed into the road and went on. He was trying to fix in his mind where he'd seen the boy when it came to him, that the boy looked like himself. This gave him the fidgets, and though he tried to shake the image of the face in the glass, it would not go. And then he's looking for dawn. As he neared the town, the roosters were calling. Perhaps they sensed a relief in the obscurity of night that the traveler could not read, though he kept watch eastward. He's looking for the dawn. He can't see any light coming. But the paragraph where he sees the boy in the bus, I mean, what's amazing about power of literature, and I hope that this passage struck you, okay, is that you can't distill it down to bullet points to put into an essay. He sees this boy sitting in the back of the bus. Everyone else, he sees their face in profile, meaning that, they're facing ahead. This one boy sitting in the back of the bus has his nose pressed on the window. He can't see anything, but he's looking for whatever is out there. And it's dark, so he can't see Lester, but he looks at Lester, and Lester looks back. And he realizes that the boy looked like himself. What do you do with that? Does he see himself, his own self, as a little boy, and does he recognize his own humanity for a moment, that he could have turned out differently? Does he see in this boy somebody looking into the darkness, not just accepting the easy answers, but probing at the seams of society, the weak points where there's this vast darkness out there that we all basically put our heads in the sand to ignore, but this little boy is cursed or whatever, or has the sight to look beyond that fabric and to see this vast darkness. He's on a church bus. At any rate, Ballard sees himself there. And for me, I mean, and then Ballard's looking for the dawn that the rooster seemed to sense is coming, though he can't see any light looking eastward. It's just such a human picture of Ballard. And then at the end of that chapter, he goes to the hospital desk. The night duty nurse had just come down the hall with a cup of coffee and found Ballard leaning against the counter. This freak, and I say that as what he would be called, and clearly he's on the outer rim of how far a human can go. At any rate, this freak walks back from the wilderness into human society and leans on the counter of this hospital as the nurse walks down the hall with a cup of coffee. And then to continue reading, a weed-shaped, one-armed human. And McCarthy chooses that word carefully. A weed-shaped, one-armed human swaddled up in outsized overalls and covered all over with red mud. His eyes were caved and smoking. "I'm supposed to be here," he said. He turns himself in, and he's characterized as a human, quote, swaddled and caked, covered with red mud. It's as if he's been finally born into the human race at the cost of at least 8 other lives. Then it goes on. Now, the theme of the degradations and objectification that the human body undergoes continues, because what happens to him after he finally dies, unbeknownst to the medical students, page 194, that are just practicing dissection on, bodies from the morgue. But, it's probably likely that, I don't know, in the 60s, if they still, if they had the thing where you can donate your body to science and do whatever you want with me, but they probably just used convicts' bodies or things like that. At any rate, his body was shipped to the state medical school at Memphis. There in a basement room, he was preserved with formalin and wheeled forth to take his place with other deceased persons newly arrived. And I like that. He wheeled forth to take his place with other deceased persons. He's anonymous now. He is not the freak. He's just another body. He was laid out on a slab and flayed, eviscerated, dissected. His head was sawed open and the brains removed. His muscles were stripped from his bones. His heart was taken out. His entrails were hauled forth and delineated, and the 4 young students who bent over him like those haruspices of old perhaps saw monsters worse to come in their configurations. At the end of 3 months, when the class was closed, Ballard was scraped from the table into a plastic bag and taken with others of his kind to a cemetery outside the city and there interred. A minister from the school read a simple service. End of chapter, end of Ballard's story. I'll let you make of it what you will to some degree, but clearly the emphasis on his own body being now used, commodified for a good purpose, right? But used, objectified, literally objectified by being cut into its component parts to serve medical science that, in some degree saves lives. How many lives, do these doctors save over the course of their careers in the future or whatever, right? The other note from this little passage, though, his heart, his brain are taken out, and then in his entrails, his intestines. I'll get back to those in a second. But heart, brain, part of the question is, what makes a human a human? Is it having a human body? Wherein lies evil? It's obviously not in actually the muscle that pumps our blood around our heart. Is evil in the brain of this person? Did it look different, when they dissected it? The entrails, that's a reference if you're not familiar. There's all sorts of ways that people throughout history have tried to tell the future, tea leaves in a cup or whatever, reading cards, and looking at entrails from animals that have been killed is one. So, looking at the intestines of animals and discerning, well, this is what's coming. And so it says here, his entrails were hauled forth and delineated, lined out. So, it's almost as if they're doing a reading of it, which of course they're not. But and the 4 young students who bent over him like those haruspices of old, perhaps some monsters worse to come in their configurations. Like, is this what humanity's becoming or something? Anyway. And then finally, of course, the bodies of the women, in just the next chapter over, are discovered. And you probably noticed throughout, their bodies are laying on these kind of shelves in the caves, like the bodies of saints of old would have been interred in their tombs. And when they go to bring them out, the sunlight, in this leaning bowl of light standing there among the shifting motes they call for rope, there's this sunlight coming down on the bodies. The rope drew taut, and the first of the dead sat up on the cave floor. I don't want to push this point too far, because neither I nor McCarthy would want to diminish the horror of what Lester did. But in some ways, let's put this in a very perverted way, Lester almost cares more for the bodies of these dead women, some of, all of whom he killed after the first one, of these dead women, cares for them more than the society, and human society in general, has cared for the bodies of living women, in his way that he treats them with a sort of reverence. And again, I don't want to push that too far. But to close this out, McCarthy at the beginning is kind of showing, with the sale of the land and Lester being put outside the community, the ways in which humans in a group make individual humans the bearers of all that's wrong with human society. And it doesn't in any way negate the individual responsibility of Lester. But the point McCarthy seems to be making throughout is that that people like Lester are sustained by the society around them in some sort of inverse way. And then finally, page 4, McCarthy says, there he is, Lester, in the barn, a child of God, much like you or me. And so I'll leave it there.